Horace Cleveland. You could call him temperamental.
Lazy dog! Can't you drive any faster?
Contemptible.
This place is not fit for a dog to sleep in.
Or just not nice.
Incompetent nincompoop.
But on a vacation in Italy with his mother, things take a sudden turn.
Do not go.
Horace, what was that?
Into the carriage, quickly!
But Horace has made a terrible mistake.
I saw something. The woods, a shadow.
I'm sure it isn't anything to Driver! Giacomo!
He's kidnapped by a band of robbers. Horace now has 7 days to live. 7 days to discover redemption before he dies in the Robber's Cave. Bring this exciting adventure home. Go to lamplighter.net and order your own copy of The Robber's Cave. Lamplighter, building character one story at a time.
And now, Fastened Like Nails with Dr. Mark Hamby.
Welcome to Fastened Like Nails, and today we're going to continue our study in the parables of Luke. We're going to look at chapter 16, and in the studio with me again is Pastor Justin. Welcome again.
Thank you.
Okay, here we go. We finished with the amazing study of the prodigal father, prodigal son, the reckless love of the father. Wow, when you brought in the part about Jacob and Esau, that blew me away. That is so extraordinary. Now, did you get that from a book? Did you think that God gave that to you?
I believe Timothy Keller's book, The Prodigal God, makes that connection with the Jacob and Esau story in Genesis 33. I believe that's where I was provoked to look it up.
What's the title of it again?
The Prodigal God.
Prodigal God. Oh, I have to get that.
That's an enjoyable read.
Mm-hmm. Did he pass away?
He did.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I've always enjoyed his writings. Mm-hmm. Okay, without any further delay, we're going to go from the last thing that Jesus said was, your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. And then the way that this is put together, Dr. Luke goes right into the next parable and says, and he also said to the disciples. And so now we're moving from the Pharisees. He was talking to the Pharisees. Now he's talking to the disciples without us really knowing how the Pharisees handled what he just said. So this has been spliced together for a reason. And so starts off with there's this rich man who had a manager or a steward. And we know him as the unjust steward. Pastor Justin, take it from there.
Yeah, it could be helpful to sketch in some of the larger context as well. It seems, again, the way Luke has put this together, that we should read this as continuing straight on from the previous three parables. So Jesus is still teaching amongst the crowds. And we're going to see after the story is over in verse 14 that the Pharisees are still there. And he's addressing them as well.
Interesting.
And so he turns to give a message directly to the disciples within the hearing, it seems, of the Pharisees.
Oh, got it.
So I think there's this dual audience we have to keep in mind, which is true in most of the parables. He teaches them to the crowds, which are a mixed group. And so I think it's important to remember the background, even at the beginning of chapter 15, where the Pharisees' approach to Jesus was because he was eating with tax collectors and sinners. And that, I think, continues. He addresses his disciples with this parable of the rich man who had a steward and how that's going to turn out in order to teach them something for the disciples, but it's also going to have a message for the Pharisees. Whether they get it or not, we shall see. So the story begins with a rich man, a wealthy man, and he's got a steward who has done something wrong, it seems. Somebody has brought an accusation against him that he was wasting the master's possessions. So his rich man has entrusted to him the care of his estate and his resources, and he's been out there squandering them. It's actually the same word that we saw in the parable of the prodigal, where the younger son had squandered his inheritance. The word wasting in verse 1 there is the same word in Greek. And so this is what he's done with his master's possessions. His stewardship has been very unfaithful, unrighteous, unjust.
So the son, the younger son, also wasted his father's.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
So there is a connection between the two parables established right there at the beginning.
Interesting.
And so the rich man summons his steward to give an account. and also to fire him, essentially. Verse 2 has him being fired. Turn in the account of your management or your stewardship. Give me your books so I can pass those books on to a new steward, and we can do an audit and correct whatever's been done wrong there. So he's being fired. And so the twist in the story comes right here, where the steward begins to think to himself. And this is often a feature of Jesus' parables, where you get a kind of an internal monologue. And so the steward begins thinking out, what's he going to do? So he asks himself, what shall I do? Well, that's very interesting. Typically, when we want wisdom, we ask other people for advice. Asking myself for advice is not generally a good idea.
Interesting.
What shall I do, since my master is taking the stewardship away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. So he sees those as his major options. But in verse 4, it occurs to him, I have decided what to do. He has his aha moment and figures out what he's going to do. But here's the key. In verse 4, so his plan, his scheme at this point has a particular goal in mind, so that when I am removed from my stewardship, people, they, may receive me into their houses. Okay, so he's wanting to do something that's going to enable him to be welcomed into some other people's houses. Now, at this point, it's not clear who are the people, but the very next line in verse 5 probably gives us who he's talking about. So he summons his master's debtors. That's probably who he's expecting that are going to welcome him after this is over. So he summons his master's debtors one at a time, and we get two examples of the kind of thing that he said to them. How much do you owe my master? And so essentially in this context, he's got to pull out the contract that they had established before. And so the steward has been responsible for the relationship between this rich, wealthy landowner and his tenants, who have probably rented part of his property to farm out. And the agreement would have been that at the harvest, the owner is going to get a large portion of the proceeds from their renting his property. And so the steward is responsible for managing that arrangement. And so he turns to these debtors, he calls them in one at a time, and he takes out the contract and he says, how much do you owe? So he's asking them to verify what they wrote in the original contract. And so he takes the first one and asks him the question, how much do you owe my master? In verse 6, we get the response of the first one, 100 measures of oil, which is a huge amount. This is one of those extravagant details in the parable. Large, large sum. So the wealthy man is rich. The debtors are rich. Everybody's rich in this story. And this is a huge debt. And so he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. So the debtor then takes the contract in hand and in his own handwriting scratches out the number 100 and writes in 50 in his own handwriting. I think that's an important part of the picture to see, that this is verified by the debtor here. And so he changes his debt down to 50. And the second is called in to do the same thing. With 100 measures of wheat, take your bill and write 80. So reducing that.
So is he not doing this because he doesn't want his own handwriting in there to show the master can't go back on him and say, like, you did this?
That's probably part of it, is to just pin the blame on him, so that he did it as though he did it in private.
Right.
So that it involves these other conspirators, if you will. The debtors become a part of the larger conspiracy, so that they can't rat on him or anything. And there's another point that's going to come out here that's implied, because the whole point of the parable, and this is where the punchline comes in the story, in verse 8, the master commended or praised and Jesus labels him as the unrighteous or dishonest manager or steward. So Jesus gives him that label. He's dishonest, unrighteous in what he has done here, but the master praises him for his shrewdness. Now, there's discussion and debate about, is this the end of the parable, or does the parable actually continue to the next line? And there are different students of Scripture conclude different things about that. My view is that that's where the story ends. Jesus is going to start explaining his point right there in the middle of verse 8. So if the story ends right here, the punchline is the master, the wealthy man at the beginning of the story, praises the steward for his shrewdness in all of this. So you've got to imagine what's just happened. So he's turned in his account books to the master. And so the master's looking and he sees what's happened. He sees that was 100 and it's been scratched out and 50 was written on there. He knows that this would be something that the debtors did. So he comes to two sudden realizations all at once. First, he realizes he's just been cheated out of a lot of profit. His profit margin has gone way down. But almost immediately at the same time, he's realized that these debtors are going to be thinking of him as the most generous man in the world, because their assumption has to be that the steward was authorized to reduce this debt. And so suddenly he realizes that, yes, he's lost a lot of profit, but in the eyes of his debtors, he's the best boss in the world. And so his social credit just went way up. They're praising him in the streets probably. And so he's assuming, he sees this as a very praiseworthy thing because he knows that the steward has put him in a position where he would never call out the steward for what he's done. He will never tell people why he fired the steward. The steward doesn't get his job back here. He's going to continue off and lose his job, but he praises him because he's done what he set out to do. He's made friends, that Jesus will use that term in just a moment. He's made these friends with his debtors so that they'll hire him, they'll take him in because he's represented this wealthy man, and they'll assume that the wealthy man is the one who told the steward to cut down their debts. There would be a reasonable explanation for why he would do that. He might recognize that the harvest is not going to go well this year, that the crops are not coming in as well as they would have anticipated, and so they couldn't meet their contractual obligation. And so out of kindness to them, he reduces the debt. Of course, that wasn't what he did, but the steward makes it look like that's what he did. And so the manager has gone up in his reputation, and he's not going to sacrifice that. That's worth a lot to him. And so he sees this as a very shrewd and crafty decision of the steward in working both sides of the table, so to speak, so that he's put himself in a very good position.
Does that connect at all, though, with the prodigal son's story? Is there any connection between the two?
Not in that sense, not in the way that I can see that, because I think you got to contrast, if nothing else, because the prodigal son, the younger son, squandered all of his resources in wild living. I mean, it was just gone, and the outcome was really bad for him until he returned to his father. So here you've got this picture of a guy who is labeled for shrewdness. Now, this is where everything gets muddled. We've got to decide, what is shrewdness, a good thing or a bad thing? And it can be either. And I think a lot of the confusion comes in when we think about something Jesus said in another place. In Matthew's gospel, we have a line, I think it's in Matthew 10, where Jesus tells his disciples to be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves. And here you get the commendation, the praise of shrewdness, and you've got to decide, is that something here that Jesus wants his disciples to emulate? Does he want them to take on this kind of shrewdness? And my suggestion is that he does not. One thing that we should remember is that this word shrewd is the same word used to describe the serpent in Genesis 3. Now, again, it's a neutral term. It could be a positive thing. To be wise in a street smarts kind of way is a good thing. But when the serpent is labeled that way in Genesis 3, it's definitely a negative thing, where he's taken something that could be good, a kind of wisdom, but twisted it to be manipulative and destructive. That's what I see in the story, is that this shrewdness that's on display is a worldly kind of wisdom. And so I see Jesus making the point that, disciples, you should not be this way. And it's going to, as he explains his points, because he's going to lay out what I think are 5 points from this parable in the next few verses that make it clear, especially when he comes to talk about the Pharisees and their response to all of this, that the kind of shrewdness on display in the parable is the kind of shrewdness that the Pharisees exhibit, that their way of handling wealth is akin to what's in the story. And the disciples need to avoid that, because there is a danger for Christians, even today as we think about the application, to be sucked into the world's ways of handling wealth, the world's ways of using money that are manipulative and damaging to other people. And that's ultimately, I think, Jesus is giving that warning to his disciples. And when the Pharisees are there, and their response is going to be to ridicule him for this story. They've kept quiet up to this point, it seems, but they're going to mock him for this particular story. And Jesus is going to respond to them very harshly in verse 14 and 15. So that's where we're at in the story. You want to jump in there at all?
Well, okay, so I've always thought, verse 16, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. What I find, and just before that, he says this, he says, and I tell you, make to yourselves friends by means of the unrighteous wealth, that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwelling. So you haven't talked about the eternal dwellings.
I haven't yet, no.
Okay, so we got two different views here, and I think this is all right. I think it's good to be able to approach the Scriptures and roll up our sleeves and wrestle it out.
Yeah.
But I've never heard that view before, so that makes this interesting. But I've always thought that Jesus was teaching to use our unrighteous mammon, money, to make friends by means of the unrighteous money. Make to yourselves friends so that when it fails, they will receive you into everlasting habitations, meaning that let's use, the love of money is the root of all evil, but money is not evil.
Right.
So use that money, use our resources to make friends, to minister to other people, to serve other people well, so that when it fails, when it's no longer usable, when you're dead, when money is of no value to you anymore, that the people that you've ministered to throughout your lifetime, they're going to be there to minister unto you now. So 2 Peter chapter 1 says, so an entrance will be ministered unto you abundantly into the everlasting kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ. And it's talking about how we are ministering to other people. And so I think you would agree with that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So 2 Peter, there's this grand welcoming of a person when he dies. He now enters into the kingdom, and there's this grand entrance of people ministering now to you that you've ministered to them. So I've got to wrap my head around this, Justin, because you're kind of going in a different direction of the meaning of this verse. You're telling me that, at least I'm thinking what I'm hearing you say, is that this man, his shrewdness is not a good thing.
That's what I'm saying, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that until you change my mind otherwise, that Jesus is using this illustration to say, hey, even though this guy was an unjust steward, he did something really wise. He lowered the debts of his master's debtors so that, and this is how I've always been thinking, so that the master's at least getting something back. If they owed so much, why haven't they been paying on this?
Sure.
And so now the master's going to get back a little bit more than he maybe wasn't anticipating getting.
Right.
Okay, so that's how I've taken it up until now. So this is interesting. Let's keep going and see if you're going to change my mind at all.
Yeah, so let's back up for just a moment. If Jesus' explanation starts in the middle of verse 8, which I think it does, but there's room for disagreement there as well. He says, for the sons of this world, or this age, are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So there's a couple of things in that statement that lead me to look at the story and say, we're looking at all bad guys in the story. And there's a lesson here for the good guys, which are the disciples listening to the story, the sons of light. There are no sons of light in the story. In the story, everybody is a son of this age. And so that phrase is only used one other place in Luke's gospel, where it contrasts with those who are going to be sons of the resurrection. And so we're looking at the reality of unbelievers. And so when we look at the rich man himself, the steward, and the debtors, they're all caught up in this worldly system of handling wealth. And so that was kind of the first clue in my mind that said, everybody's a villain in this story. There aren't any good guys in the story, perhaps. And then remembering the shrewd term applying to the serpent might be significant there. But then Jesus' use of their own generation kind of emphasized that for me, because in Luke's gospel, and perhaps all of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when Jesus talks about the generation that he's a part of, they're always evil, twisted, corrupt, and fallen. And so that created a picture in my mind of this story being a picture of how the world treats itself. So everybody's responding to each other in various worldly ways.
That's interesting. For the sons, in the King James, the sons of this generation are wiser than the children of light.
Right.
So the sons of this generation, including the unjust steward and all that he was doing with the money and all of that,
right.
The sons of this generation are wiser, not wiser in a positive sense, shrewd in a negative sense. than the sons of light. So why aren't they? Why the sons of light? I'm not getting that.
Yeah, so I think he's identifying his disciples. So they're outside the story. They're the audience. His disciples are the sons of light. And so the idea would be, again, the comparison goes, the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light are with their own generation. So he's saying the sons of this age deal with each other in this shrewd way. The sons of light do not deal with each other in that way. And so he's raising up a comparison. They're more shrewd. And that's where the understanding of verse 9 perhaps becomes pivotal. The make friends command. This is where my interpretation takes a turn, perhaps.
Okay.
Where I would hear him saying this, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth or unrighteous mammon, as a sarcastic kind of command. So that he's saying, go ahead. Make friends for yourselves in the way that the steward did in the story, so that when it fails, because it will fail, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Now, again, how we interpret eternal dwellings is going to be key. And so here's where we'll take a little detour into the Old Testament for just a moment. Okay. There is one place, and exactly one place in the Old Testament where
eternal
dwellings, which is the word for tents, and eternal are described together, and it's Psalm 49. So if we could turn back there for just a minute, we'll see pretty clearly what's going on, at least in that context. And so the turn on the interpretation here is going to depend on whether we're confident or how confident we are that Jesus actually has Psalm 49 in mind. If he doesn't, then we probably need to go back to the more typical understanding. So Psalm 49, 11 is the key verse. We could probably just focus there, but if we read the whole psalm, there are several resonances with the story. There's a lot of connection with the unrighteous wealth that's going on in Psalm 49. But Psalm 49, 11, speaking of these wicked folks, their graves are their homes forever. That's the eternal word. Their dwelling places, that's the tent word, to all generations, though they called lands by their own names. And so this is the one place in the Old Testament where you have the term tents described with the language of eternal. There's parallelism here, but the idea, I think, is relatively clear there. In this context, in Psalm 49, that's not heaven. That's very clearly the wicked going to the place of punishment forever. If Jesus is drawing on that by using this unique phrase, eternal dwellings here, then he is saying that when the unrighteous mammon fails, they're going to receive you into the eternal dwellings of hell. And if that's right, then he is very much warning them and saying, you don't want to be like that. That's the destination that you're going to get if you go there.
Okay, that's really interesting because that would then be a segue into the next parable with Lazarus and the rich man. Ooh.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things when you look at the bigger piece of chapter 16, you've got these sayings right here in between the two parables, starting there maybe in the middle of verse 8, but going down through verse 18. And then verse 19, you have this other parable that begins the same way. There was a rich man, and it may be that we should look at the explanation that Jesus is giving between the two parables as a kind of bridge that in some ways applies both ways, linking the two stories. And if so, that reinforces perhaps the idea that Jesus is targeting the Pharisees here in the background. He's warning his disciples about being sucked into the way the Pharisees handle money, saying that you don't want to do that because their end is going to be destruction. And again, I think a sarcastic tone might be at play here. When it fails, when your money fails you, as it inevitably will, and ultimately when you die, your money's not going to do you any good. There will be people to receive you and to welcome you into the eternal dwellings, the eternal tents of Psalm 49, which is not a good thing.
Okay, so in 1 Timothy chapter 6,
Yes.
I'm going to read this. This is very appropriate, I think. It says this. It says, "But as for you, O man of God, flee these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, and love, steadfastness, gentleness. Fight the good fight of faith. Lay hold on eternal life, that which you are called." And then at the very end of this, chapter 6, he ends it. This is amazing, Justin. He ends this in verse 16 and says, "To him be honor and eternal dominion. Amen." And then there's like this P.S.
Yeah, right.
"As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. I love that verse. I mean, if you really seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, everything that you need will be added to you.
Right.
It's really amazing. It's an amazing life to live. I've been saved now for 47 years. My spiritual birthday is July 22nd. I'll be 48 years old in the Lord. So cool, you know. And God, he's kept his promises, all 8,767 of them. I've not seen God not keep his promises yet. Pretty amazing. But he goes on to say this: don't set your hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good and to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may lay hold on that which is truly life. Notice that phrase there, storing up treasure for themselves.
Right.
You know, I love that, because that's really what, and that goes along with 2 Peter chapter 1. You know, so an entrance will be ministered unto us abundantly.
Right.
So the opposite is true. If hell really does have people receiving them or communicating with each other in hell, we don't really know, other than that there's weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Sure.
Right. And I think we're going to get a little bit more of an insight when we go to the next parable, when the rich man actually has this conversation with Abraham, right? You know, and saying, send somebody to tell my brothers and all of this stuff. So maybe there is communication. C.S. Song wrote this. I'll never forget it. He said, there are no stories in hell. He said, the stories, the only story that will continue will be the story of those that come to know Jesus as their Savior. Their story continues, a new chapter. But in hell, the story is the end. Kind of, really. Yeah. I can't even go there sometimes in my mind.
Sure.
Okay,
right.
so back to chapter 16.
Yeah, let's.
If what you're saying, I've never heard this view, and I was really prepared to really let you have it this morning, because Sarah told me what you were going to teach, and I'm going there's no way. There's no possible way. But I think it's very possible now.
So if we carry on in Jesus' explanation, again, he makes several points that I think are drawn from the parable, and you can tie back some of the details. When he talks about, in verse 10, one who is faithful in a very little. Well, that was the steward. Or that was not the steward. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. That's what the sons of light, the disciples, need to be. They need to be faithful in what little they have now, so that later they will be faithful with greater things. But then he turns to the other side, one who is dishonest, unrighteous. That's that same term that Jesus used to describe the steward. In a very little is also dishonest or unrighteous in much. And so you can see the story play out where he was unrighteous in the first place, where he squandered his master's wealth. Well, then he cheated him in an even greater way at the end. Yeah. And so I think Jesus is pulling on those details of the story to make that point for his disciples as a warning.
Okay, this is amazing, because I have never heard this view, and everyone has always been here's the unjust steward, and Jesus is saying that he did a great thing. Right. You know, and then Jesus keeps calling them unjust and unrighteous, and it doesn't really fit, does it?
Well, that's the thing. I've heard it taught, and I've read a lot, and people recognize there's some unsolved mysteries, if you will, in the story when you take it that way.
There's tension there,
and that's fine. Yeah. We don't necessarily understand everything Jesus taught, and that's fine.
Wow.
But I think understanding that there's a warning here, and that he's talking about the danger of hell ultimately here, changes everything. Everything seems to fall into line there with his explanations. The same thing in verse 12, if you've not been faithful in that which is another's. So again, that was the steward. He wasn't faithful with his master's wealth. Who will give you that which is your own? And so that's where, again, he's talking to the sons of light. What is your own? Well, that's the inheritance. Again, maybe echoing back to the parable of the two lost sons. You have an inheritance that belongs to you, but you're not going to get it if you act like the steward. And no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other. Well, truly, this steward hated his wealthy master because he was really serving money. And that's why he treated him the way that he did. He squandered his wealth, and at the end, he cheated him even further. Well, that's hatred. That's despising, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So Jesus really presses home the point very clearly that you've got to make a choice here. You cannot serve both at the same time. And in the story, you have him the steward very clearly serving money all along the way.
They say you can tell a person's heart by their checkbook.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You know, when I was first saved, our church started a building project. And so, first of all, to learn about tithing, that I had to give 10% was like new. I came from the Roman Catholic Church, and if I gave a quarter, that was a lot. Sure. So here it was 10% of my income, and then I started to learn, that God loves a cheerful giver, and so and then I learned about a tithe and an offering, and I'm like,
sure.
This is interesting, and really learning to trust God, right?
Right. Yes.
And then they came up with this building program idea, and we're going to build a school for our Christian school. And I'm like, whoa. And then they didn't want to, how some churches will bring in a hired, money raiser, right?
Sure.
He comes in, you pay him $30,000 to get the church to raise $60,000 or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
But the church wasn't going to do that. They were just like, folks, give a free will offering. Give out of the abundance of what God is giving you, And the pastor really promoted, be a cheerful giver. This is a time for sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget this. We had only been saved 2 years. We just got married. I'm trying to, get started in life, right? I was making $24,000 for the year. And Debbie wasn't working, getting ready for our first child. About 7 months more to go. We're going to have our first child. And we're also getting ready to build a house. Okay, so this is like, we don't have a lot of money. And I'll never forget, God was like pressing on us. This is a time to be faithful and give sacrificially, and you can't outgive me. Justin, that year, we gave double the amount, and we saved more than we had ever saved. It was like, how did God do? I still can't. It didn't. The books didn't register. Like these do not add up.
Right.
And I'll never forget that. And every year I've noticed it, that every time I am a cheerful giver, God blesses even more.
So Luke tells us the Pharisees are there who were lovers of money. So there's actually another connection back to the story here, because the word money lovers, you could translate just as well money friends. And again, going back to that command in verse 9, make friends. Well, the Pharisees have made friends with money, not by money, but with money. They're actually friends of money. And so the way Luke characterizes them fits with connecting with the steward in the parable. And they heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And now I think when he says he heard all these things, that goes back to chapter 15. So that tells us, again, we're still in that context where the Pharisees are there complaining about him welcoming and eating with tax collectors and sinners.
This is amazing. The response of the Pharisees kind of fits in with your thoughts here, because they are upset at what they just heard. And if what Jesus was saying was a positive thing, make friends with the money that you have, that they may receive you, that doesn't make sense by them being upset.
Right. Yes. I think they would have thought that the steward was a good thing, that they
Yeah.
should be like that,
Yeah.
and they ridicule him. And it's a very strong for ridicule. It's the only other time this word appears is in Luke's gospel at the crucifixion, with the chief priests and the leaders at the cross ridiculing Jesus come down from the cross. And so they're very clearly the villains here. And so Jesus' response to them is harsh. Again, so he's back to very harsh and direct with them. He said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men." And again, that's the steward in the story. He wanted to make friends. He wanted to make sure that these people would welcome him into their homes. So he's seeking to justify himself, make himself look right in their eyes so that they would receive him afterwards. So I think the Pharisees are just like that. But Jesus says, God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men, when you act like that, is an abomination in the sight of God. That's a heavy indictment for them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where you get a little bit of a transition moving toward the next parable, the rich man and Lazarus. It's hard to know exactly. Again, the string of teachings right here, verses 16 to 18 in particular, like how do they fit? But I think he's carrying on the conversation, and he's actually creating a link between these two stories.
This is really cool. In verse 15, Jesus said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts." This is interesting. He then says this, "For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." And so the Pharisees, with the unjust steward, they probably saw, as Jesus is giving this parable, they probably saw this as a probably good thing. But now Jesus is hammering them, and they get it. They've been, because they're like the rich elite. They have their own. This is their own club. Only the rich can be a part of them. Okay, so give us some summary on chapter 16, because we've taken a little bit of a detour here. What would you say this is primarily teaching?
So followers of Jesus need to make sure that they don't get caught up in the world's way of handling resources and money. It's easy to do that. We should be sensitive to the temptation that we have to use money in a way that manipulates other people for our own gain, for our self-centered purposes. And Jesus is warning us very strongly against that, because it's eternally dangerous for us to do things like that.
So if you were to say just one thing to people that are listening, what would you say about this that you haven't already said?
A side comment just about reading the parables and the New Testament. These Old Testament associations are very important. And when we can track those things down, it brings light. And so, seeing Psalm 49's connection, like I had never considered that before someone suggested the idea. And then when you see the links there, and I just, Jesus was obviously steeped in the Old Testament, but so was his audience in a way that far outstrips us typically. And so when these maybe subtle allusions are there, I think that's worth the time and the effort to try to track them down and to think through how they fit together. That's really good. So when there are red flags when we're reading something and we say like, I'm not really sure about this, but I'll go with it, that's when we got to go back and say, okay, there's something more to the story. Perhaps. Yeah. Oftentimes, yeah. Yeah, that's good. Well, with that said, thank you for joining us for another Fastened Like Nails. I'm Mark Hamby here with Pastor Justin, and we're going to do one more. In the next podcast, we're going to go into the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. God bless.
You've been listening to Fastened Like Nails, a presentation of Lamplighter Ministries. Our mission is to make ready a people prepared for the Lord by building Christ-like character, one story at a time. To learn more about our family collection of rare books, dramatic audios, or guild programs, visit lamplighter.net. To hear more podcasts, search for Fastened Like Nails wherever you listen to podcasts.